If humanity survives for several thousands of years, I wonder how the human thumb will evolve. Well, you have to figure, given evolutionary science and what we know of how bipedal humanoids slowly developed over time on this planet, it's a proper possibility to ponder. What will become of the human thumb? And the pinky, for that matter. Oh my. You come to think about it, the bigger these things get, the bigger our hands have to evolve to hold the blasted things. And then everybody can just palm a basketball. And that lowers the excellence bar in that sport just a little bit. All of that just from nomophobia, the fear of being disconnected. So here we all are, landscape or vertical, calloused pinky knuckles. Yeah, you won't unnotice that. You're welcome. All the while, your fingers are stretched to the limits, while this little thing that sets us apart from most of the species on this planet that could destroy us, the opposable thumb, for nearly half a century, it's gotten the workout it's never seen before. In fact, with the advancement of video games in the 1980s, and then the development of the internet and texting in the 90s and the 2000s, just imagine how generations of that sort of workout will look in 9 or 10 generations down the road. We may be able to do away with guns altogether. Well, first of all, who could hold one with a big old knob thumb? And then we just have this little shillelagh on our hands. We can just whap each other into submission. The Great Social Media Experiment is a series focused on the cultural pros and cons of social media and internet technology that's connected us more than ever before, while dividing us almost like never before. It's about the sacrifices and compromises we're willing to make to be on top of the latest trends and how we're all being taken for granted, exploited, and sold out to the highest bidders. There is a cost, and we don't often consider the costs, especially when the trade-off is so satisfying. But the cost of a dozen glazed yeasty yum-yum donuts isn't just in dollars and cents, y'all. It's the glucose shock, the carb coma, the caloric overload and dehydration. It's the temporary or permanent damage consuming that all the time could cause. The cost of social media, my friends, is personal responsibility and responsible oversight, two things at which we, the people, are not great. But we're quickly losing what little influence and power we have left in this system. And that system is collapsing because we don't stand up and take our piece, especially online, especially in the social media space where we are the commodity and we are the currency. And welcome to the podcast. I'm not a prophet, and I'm not for profit. Well, I'm for reasonable profit in our current paradigm, but I'm also for a completely flipped paradigm, one that better reflects the values of the majority of the people in this country, if we could get past all the brainwashing, gaslighting, and cultism. What am I for? Right now, until we can find a better way, capitalism with a conscience, some sense of morality in our system. Ultimately, that's an undertone of the great social media experiment. This series, I've chronicled my time on social media over the years, the things that I've observed in people's behaviors and how they present themselves in public, virtually. With little regard to how anyone viewed me, I chose to stand up and speak loudly as things devolved socially in the 2000s. I've always been outspoken and opinionated, but it's safe to say that being opinionated and outspoken before one knows how to be is, well, I wasn't always this. But even as I slowly clawed my way out of that toxic white Southern culture's influence, I was still then a public figure living at the mercy of my paycheck, a paycheck written by a radio station owner, whichever it was, and they were always right-leaning. But as I began to see the blatant racism after 9/11 and with President Obama's election, I began to realize, thanks to social media, that America didn't change. America didn't grow. The undercurrent of tolerated racism and bigotry in this country wasn't an exception to the rule. It was the rule. America had a lot farther to go than my white male cis-presenting privilege realized. I felt like living in the South, spending most of my adult life working in country radio and the country music industry, my perspective on casual racism was skewed. I let a lot of stuff go because I felt like my perspective was uniquely biased, because I felt like I saw more problematic toxic behavior than most of America. It's sort of like if you live in an area where crime rates are high and you can't park outside without your car getting broken into. You have to work really hard to ensure your worldview isn't that America's just a crime-ridden shithole, or at least your city is. We tend to cast wide nets with our opinions, be they about people, places, or things. Maybe part of why I didn't speak out the way I do now is that I was afraid then of saying that all conservatives are white supremacists and support Nazis. Now, I wanted to say that out loud back then because I believed it as much as I do now, but I was always discouraged from mass generalizations. I am no longer afraid of casting those aspersions. Some wide cast nets apply. Americans didn't learn from their mistakes or the mistakes of early 20th century Europe. So I got a little louder, and a little louder, till I finally got a megaphone. And then I got louder and more opinionated on social media. What that did was draw out some of the worst in people. And my curiosity getting the best of me, I kind of like to poke the bear to see how horrible they're willing to be to another person, to other people. I'll cover that a lot more in the next episode. A lot of Overthinking Everything is about deconstructing my culture of cultism. But what I've discovered in my journey is that the more I share of my perspectives and experiences, the more people open up and share their own. In listening to those, I began to see that it wasn't just me. Even if they didn't quite see it yet, even if our experiences weren't exactly aligned, most of them were almost there, almost to that critical tipping point of deconstructing everything you think you know about stuff we know hardly anything about. Social media has both contributed to that deconstruction for many, but also driven more into cultism and many more deeper into the cultisms they were already awash in. We are at any given moment a click away from any and everything we could ever want or need to know. The internet is filled with people who want to tell you how to think and how to spend your money. As we learned in our last episode, our virtual spaces will come and have come to mimic our real spaces. So what happens when our real spaces aren't appropriate to begin with? What would AI do with that? My journey through toxic white Southern culture and the traumas I endured may not be unique, but I assure you there are a lot of questions I have about how I didn't end up at a MAGA rally cheering on Andrew Tate. I was toxic and problematic as a younger man. I had some really unhealthy and wrong attitudes about, well, everybody. I was an angry, entitled kid with a chip on his shoulder and an ego like a supernova with nothing to back it up except I wasn't one of them. Fill in that blank. Daddy issues I wouldn't recognize until decades later. Mommy issues I'd misunderstand for decades. Suffering and struggling amidst my own trauma and coping and dealing with that in problematic ways. Traumatized people, traumatizing other traumatized people. I was a dick. How did I come out of that and into whatever this is when that was my default setting culturally? Now think about that. We've talked a little bit about comparing our brains to computers before. This is a key point of deconstructing. What is your default setting? First, just as being a being of electrical energy contained in a meat sack. Then what are your cultural default settings? Just like a computer, think about yourself in those terms. We customize our settings as we learn. But what is the default? What are your factory settings? My cultural and personal defaults were not where I'm at today. Even the things that were seemingly good and positive, turns out were drenched in problematic toxicity and narcissistic behavior at worst, willfully ignorant, undealt with trauma at best. In me and those around me, everyone. Many of our parents and their parents had little to no understanding of child psychology, period, or the critical stages of human development. And what happened is we were all raised by parents who had no business raising kids because they were raised by parents who had no business raising kids. That's a hard place to land. It doesn't reflect as well on those people closest to you as those rose-glassed memories we romanticize. We're just traumatized people, traumatizing other traumatized people, until we resolve that trauma and end the cycle. Even in our social media memories, those reminders of past posts on this day, we sugarcoat our lives, our experiences, in ways that aren't always reflective of what's going on in reality. Even if we overshare, ranting and raving, or just TMIing our colorectal exam for the sake of awareness, it's often filtered at least through perspective, and rarely does it tell the real history behind that post. Imagine if actual history was written that way. Imagine if religious doctrine was written that way. I've discussed in the politics of dancing how I came to some conclusions and began to question what I thought I knew about politics. In Finding Faith, Selling Our Souls, and others, I've discussed a lot of my spiritual deconstruction. In some of the more recent episodes, I've discussed a lot of my social and cultural deconstruction. Leading up to this, I've been a media guy my entire adult life. So much of my perspective of everything is seen through the lens of media. I don't watch TV like most people. I don't watch films like most people. I don't watch news like most people. I don't consume social media like most people. I don't consume media the way you do. I am the media. I know how that sounds, but what I'm saying is Josh Brandon Media does all things media. That's my jam, folks. I have a beyond behind the scenes look at it all, so that wizard behind the curtain is just something I know is always there. Suspension of disbelief is difficult for me as a stoic, but as a media person, I see the strings on the puppets no matter how hard you try to hide them. So this series is really about breaking down social media and my perspective on it through the years. I can look at it from another perspective that isn't through the lens of an entertainer, but I feel like this is the best layer of perspective to apply to this because we are all entertainers on social media. Aren't we? Aren't you? If you're posting, you're hoping for reactions. Otherwise, you're just dear diarying for the world to see, and that's kind of more creepy, if that's possible. Have you considered how creepy it is that we all feel so comfortable putting everything out there? Remember when we were kids? We roamed the streets as latchkey children, the term they used for a long time to denote children who were left to their own devices when their parents were at work, unmonitored and unobserved. Those kids got themselves ready in the morning, got to the bus stop by themselves. They walked from the bus stop back home and had a key to their house. As kids, they'd let themselves in, do their homework or whatever, fix a snack, watch some TV until their parents got home. Latchkey kids. We were warned through programs at school, after-school specials, and stern talking tos from our parents to not just hop in a candy van with a stranger. We were told code words to use, even in the 80s and 90s, because there was always a story, wherever you were, of a kid disappearing, getting into somebody's car because they said they knew your mom. I was kidnapped as a kid by someone I trusted. It was different than you might think, but still traumatic. A little perspective on the issue. We all just put everything out there, don't we? So it's easier for someone to pull up to us as we're walking home and say, "Hey, Josh, I'm a friend of Randy's. He's been taken to the hospital and asked me to come bring you to him before he goes. Hurry, we don't have much time." Now, I could ask a few questions and the dude might have some answers if he did his homework. We make it easy. We're still kind of latchkey kids in that regard. We've been given the key to the house and the responsibility to take care of ourselves, maybe our siblings, before we were really ready for that. Today, well, it's sort of no different, but it is. A lot of kids in those latchkey situations today are being raised by grandparents or parents who aren't available as much. A lot of today's latchkey kid society are more independent. Maybe. Certainly more exposed to the perils of the world. They at very least have more access to more. Those kids are doing all that and they're online with social media today. The crucial understanding of the stages of human development is missing here because a responsible society would recognize that children need certain things early on, especially as adolescents. Things like one-on-one parenting time, a focused and personalized education, and a safe environment to figure oneself out. What America gave us was parents hooked on opioids, in recovery, or in jail, or working so much just to keep up they can't afford the quality time with their families. If they have the time, money, and resources to sort out all their own traumas before inflicting their trauma onto their kids without realizing what they're doing. Generational trauma. What America gave us was a stripped-down and bled-dry public education system, starved for resources by those with an agenda of private school settings where the curriculum is anyone's call, and higher education that doesn't pay off financially in a society that sees that as education's sole benefit and goal. What America gave us was untreated mental illness and a society and culture of demonizing asking for help. Tough up culture and pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentalities traumatized generations of children away from compassion and empathy for others and themselves. What America gave us was the open floodgates of the internet and social media after they got us hooked on video games, TV, and news. Oh, we have to know the news! But what America gave children was mass marketing messages, manipulation, and malevolent masochism of money. Sounds ominous, but I assure you, it's not just alliteration. Children, specifically all of us, but children, have been marketed to since we can remember, and that makes us just a number. Even if we feel special being pitched the thing, and even if buying the thing makes us feel special, in the end, the emptiness remains, so we go consume more. We spend more. I know it sounds all zen, peace signs, love, patchouli, and hippies, but there is a peace to simplicity and avoiding materialism. Almost every spirituality on this planet speaks of avoiding becoming too attached to worldly things. Even Jesus said so. And why? Because you can't take it with you when you go. All those likes, follows, subscribes, shares, reposts, comments, they just stay there online. Unless you want to argue online is the actual afterlife, and I don't want to go there, they just don't move. They don't go into your casket or your urn. They just don't matter. We're training generations to believe that that matters, and that this currency is valuable. What that teaches some is that it doesn't matter who you are or how you have to be, getting that reaction is what's important. Feeds the addiction. The price of popularity. Now you take young people today and realize that just like everyone over 40 doesn't know a world without 24/7 television, nonstop commercials, jingles you can't get out of your head, cravings you can't quell, and persistent pitching of products in our faces all the time. Anyone under 20 has that, but exponentially more extreme. In 3 generations, we've gone from, after these messages, we'll be right back to tell kids the show was taking a break and, hey, here's some commercials, to shows being commercials for toys and products, to everything basically being about being a commercial for something. Even if it's just, hey, like my podcast. This has affected our decision-making and priorities. Research has become reading reviews. Our whole process is compromised by these mixed up values that don't align with our current capitalist culture. In fact, while I love making a lot of money doing what I do, I acknowledge pragmatically the struggles we all face and the cost of that capitalism run amok. The cost is poverty, war, exploitation, and social devolution. If everyone is happy and content, they aren't empty and consuming more and more and more to fill that void. If we seek a oneness on our own, we don't need a megachurch to tell us we're favored by some supernatural thing we may not even believe in. We're just at peace with us, the universe, and the world around us. That's an empty offering plate. The other thing, and probably the most critical for the discussion about children, is that no safe space was created for kids. There isn't an app that kids can use that's safe. Everything made for kids eventually gets corrupted. Video games made specifically for kids, adults go in and try to prey. Beyond the predatory nature of the internet and all the talk of trafficking and grooming, let's just talk about the culture children exist in socially. Now, I'm not sure what you remember of school, but the cliques, the hierarchies, they've always been there. For many young people, simply going to school does more harm to their mental health than being out of that primary socialization and doing school online. For many children, school, physical school, is where they learn how to be around other people. But the fact that schools are so strapped for funding and that education has to be so streamlined to accomplish even the most minimal standards, what's created in most situations is an unhealthy environment for learning, much less existing. I discussed in my episode, The Bully Pulpit, part of the Selling Our Soul series, how I experienced bullying at a very young age. Likely the result of my own awkwardness, trying to hold my shit together in the school and church while my family and home life was falling apart. Nothing major, just divorce. But how many of us dealt with that, and how many of us got adequate, if any, therapy? Bullying can decimate a child's academic confidence because it decimates their self-confidence. It impacts everything about them. It isn't until you get much older that you're able to differentiate the hate from the mental issues. That whole, it's more about them than it is about you rationale. That's valid. But our virtual spaces have come to mirror our reality spaces, and in some cases, exponentially amplify those experiences, maybe even into some warped caricature of what a natural response would be in real life. Just take your own experiences. Look, I've thumb-tangled with many adults online in intense, heated discussions. Now, I'm probably more prone to say what I say online to say to somebody's face, but I'm an exception to that rule, and I simply don't have a need to be fake with people. For most, that toxic and visceral response is not indicative of who they are as a person, or it is. But it certainly isn't indicative of how most people would behave in a face-to-face confrontation. Now, imagine that, but with middle schoolers, 12 to 14. Go even younger, as young as children have phones and social media these days. What you'll find is a hotbed of toxic, problematic, and disturbing exposure to ideas, and more of that dumbing down and numbing down of society. If children can't go into their own real spaces and find a safety to be themselves, develop, grow, and figure out who and what they are, and then the virtual spaces they choose are even more troubling with bullies and hateful behavior, well, it's a matter of time before we see a complete social devolution to a default setting of sociopathic, narcissistic behavior. I know that's a big claim, but when we examine those diagnoses and compare them with many online behaviors, those symptoms, even the real behavior traits, well, not just children, but all of us, we can trace a lot of the DNA of that devolution straight back to the 90s and straight back to the dawn of the internet and the age of infotainment. Those virtual spaces mimic our reality spaces. Just like computers were designed by people who had brains and thought with them, those designers made computers to store and recall information similar to how humans do. The way we interact with each other online is also very parallel in that nature. As in, the digital grid work is laid down for everything to be built on. But that digital grid work is just a ones and zeros version of our real spaces. Even the most out there science fiction is limited to our little human brains. We think we can conceive a God with what little mental, emotional, and spiritual evolution we've managed thus far. That's laughable. Now, had we sorted out a lot of our issues beforehand, this wouldn't be alarming at all. An educated utopia in real life where everyone has and uses a library card? Creating a virtual version of that? Instead, America hadn't really addressed any of the issues with our indigenous communities, much less the Black community, or any community, before just thrusting us all online to fight it out amongst ourselves. The internet, you see, is unlike any other form of media before it. While everything from carrier pigeon to broadcast was limited in either scope, reach, or some other way, America's hold my beer and watch this approach, paired with ribald conservative traditionalism, picked up the internet, took off all the guardrails, cut the brakes, and said, "Shuss!" That's mildly funny if you ski. Oh, mulligan. I've been talking about wrestling in some of these episodes. Let's try that again, shall we? The internet, you see, is unlike any other form of media before it. While everything from carrier pigeon to broadcast was limited in either scope, reach, or some other way, America's hold my beer and watch this approach, paired with ribald conservative traditionalism, took the internet, took off all the guardrails, cut the brakes, and said, "Call me Lex, 'cause we're losers." Lugers. Yeah, that's funnier in written form. Well, you get the gist of it, right? Downhill fast. With all due respect to Lex Luger, of course. We weren't prepared morally, spiritually, ethically. And I'm not talking from a specific belief system either, just human morals, spirit, and ethics. We were a generation removed from Vietnam and Nixon. We were pretty much during the Reagan and post-Reagan era. Now, I think sometimes we forget just how toxic and different it was back then in the internet's early days. I wasn't allowed to have my best friend who was Black in my house in Nashville, Tennessee, 1988. The town I grew up in was a sundown town that has a 4-H camp where a Japanese internment camp was. This may have been my experience, of course, but I've shared it enough to know I am certainly not alone. All across the country, when the internet was handed to us, well, it was like your parents took sleep aids and conked out at 9 p.m., so you had the run of the remote, and that's why they called it Skinamax. Look, what I'm discussing here, it's much deeper than which side of an ideology you rest on, if you think this, if you think that, who you voted for. I want us to seriously consider that we as a society were a wreck and unfit to have the responsibility of the internet, much less access to it 24/7 in our pockets, on our watches. I'm not saying we have to go back. We can't. Without a disaster on a Hollywood alien invasion or climate disaster level, we are all connected. We just weren't prepared for it when we got it. So now we have to reconcile the trauma and the damage done while we figure out the best path forward to keep future generations from too much, too soon trauma. In this series, I discuss the assault campaign against drag on social media in regard to this claim of grooming children. It's a nonsense allegation and deflection of the real problem of scrutiny the current conservative political movement is facing in America. From that perspective, that of the homophobic and transphobic bigots set to rid the world of the entire LGBTQ community, let's talk too much too soon. Too much too soon is something we actually can quantify and qualify if we so choose. After all, there is science behind the stages of human development. Through my graduate pursuit of a teaching degree, I learned about the specific benchmarks of learning, growth, and development each child should achieve within a certain range of time. And just like a kid's sort of short for his age, maybe he'll hit a growth spurt. We can be short developmentally for our age as well. This is hard. We've struggled and still do as a society with that R word. No, not Republican. The one still used by some people as a slur on intellectual capabilities. I can speak for my culture. Learning challenges are misunderstood. Many aren't open to it out of pride. That whole conversation gets shut down, and it goes back to American eugenics, which I'll discuss later this season. People don't want to admit that their DNA didn't perform at max. This is also due to our competition culture and strive for perfection through entertainment media. In America, mental health is seen in many regards as learning struggles. It's not something to wear as a badge of honor by my culture. This is a lot because of the tropes in our media and stories. But it's very much a cultural thing that nobody wants to be slow. Bill Cosby had a whole classic bit about it called Slow Class. Now, as a kid, that was one of my favorites. Not so much now, but I laughed so hard then because it was accurate to my experience. And it was accurate because the schools I went to also segregated the special needs and special ed kids away from Gen Pop. They ate at separate tables at lunch. They had their own classes, if not a whole part of the school sometimes to themselves. And maybe you're close to my age, however old the casting director thinks I look. And maybe your experience was all the kids integrated together. Still, in the 80s and into the 90s, at least in some areas, we were stigmatizing things without realizing just to what extreme. What my generation was taught, subliminally. Fox and Lion, Aesop, acquaintance lessens prejudice. So keeping the kids separate may have spared some from bullying or whatever, but it deprived other kids like me of an opportunity to see those children as people. Of course, I knew they were people, but I wasn't around people different than me. And anyone who was different was pointed out and mocked, either to their face or behind their backs, by, me or other people. Kids were afraid to struggle in school, so they faked it. Or they presented as tough, like they didn't care. We've seen that on so many television shows, haven't we? That tough kid who, we find out can't read, and that's why he's so tough. When it comes time to read out loud in class, he gets attitude and gets sent to the principal. Then it's in-school suspension for a few days, so by the time he gets back in class, he's missed the whole lesson. Wash, rinse, repeat. Again and again and again and again and again. How many kids did you know like that? Then take some of those kids who struggled with learning challenges that today we know are normal for their stage of development and academic settings. But back then, they sure were called something else. Well, you take those kids and you put them on a sports team or some other privileged class in the academic setting that isn't based on grades, results, and intelligence. Then take No Child Left Behind and similar legislation that basically said you can't fail a kid. Now, that sounds good on paper, I guess, but then you're just graduating kids who don't hit the standards. Rather than designing the academic environment to cater to the learner, we forced children who learn in a spectrum of unique but similar ways to try and fit into the teacher or school's box. Square pegs, round holes, and a big old mallet. Not only did we stigmatize learning challenges, we disabled generations from having the confidence to ask for help. Then we defunded all of those schools, even as our understanding of all these challenges exponentially increased and justified multiplying the spending. Then, culturally, we demonized education, created this culture of anti-intellectualism, willful ignorance, and limited thinking. We branded the value of education the salary you'd earn, with no promotion on the value of just being smart, knowing things. Then we had all the things anyone could know and plopped our little cultural toddler brains down in front of the brainwash box and put us all on the 5G spin cycle. It's no wonder this space, this virtual space, mimics our real space, and it's filled with misinformation, half-truths, and propaganda. It's confusing, and the lines of reality, just like on television the last quarter century or so, are blurred. It's not a statement of intellect or education to suggest someone falls for fake stories on the internet. There is some personal responsibility, of course, but this is a bigger institutional issue of teaching a society of people, failing a society. Overthinking everything, at least in part, is ensuring that we're forming our opinions from the highest ground possible for the greatest good. By the way, when you examine an opinion you have, try looking around the room at who else is echoing that same opinion. Maybe the people you're standing with, physically or on social media, should factor into your opinion just a little. For example, I grew up with a learned disdain for the Catholic Church for its centuries of atrocities against humanity and the godless evil influence of its for-profit control cult. Like it or not, a big chunk of this planet is controlled by the Catholic Church, which then extends its arm to the rest of organized Christianity, whether anybody wants to admit that or not. I'm not just talking about the sex abuses. I'm talking about the influence and dictating the flow of humanity's history. Yeah, I know, conspiracy theory, sure, but forgive me for this ahead of time, but when I watched Porky's 2, I think it was 2, where the KKK went after Billy, I think, the Catholic kid. I'm not going to go double check that and cross-reference because Porky's was part of my too much too soon trauma in life. I watched that as a child way too much. But when I saw the Klan, a group that I was taught was ignorant and evil by my racist father, when I saw them attack the same group I had heard criticized for being evil everywhere, and not a truth to think. But I wasn't going to have the same opinions as the Klan. So I dug and learned and found what I had learned was partially correct. Now, did it warrant me turning on Catholics as people? No. Just like anything else, it's hard not to categorize because they're in a thing that I absolutely oppose, but I also understand cultism, so that's where my compassion comes in. Individually, not institutionally. I had to work to differentiate. I had to spend years learning why the KKK attacks Catholics, and it ain't for the same reasons, y'all. But most people, with their opinions, they don't even go the first step of questioning if the thing they think is the thing to think. For me, I wasn't going to stand on the same side of the room as the KKK or any hate group on any issue. For me, seeing anything I thought be shared by groups like that, it made me, overthink everything. So when I see people from a church standing on the same side of a protest as a Nazi, I lose my compassion. Rather, I reserve my compassion for those who deserve it. While I do preach many principles of understanding and empathy, I also draw hard lines in the sand on certain principles and ideologies. Hate, bigotry, fascism, oppression, Nazis, just to name a few. There are things we must stand up against. We didn't enough for a long time. And just as society was sort of starting to, the internet. And all that gross toxicity also found homes on the internet, in the darkest little corners where it could grow, fester, and recruit. Imagine Waco, Ruby Ridge, or even the Montana Freeman we talked about a few episodes earlier in today's social media space, where anything goes. Well, you don't have to, because it's out there. It's online, anywhere you want to look, especially in the places you don't want to look. Now, too much too soon. This isn't the argument the anti-drag, anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ, anti-everything white nationalist movement is about. They want the whole community to cease to exist. They're so scared they'll find a woman attractive and find out a little too late she wasn't born a woman. And to them, their little bitty, little binary brains, they can't see that that very fear itself is toxic and rooted in a very unhealthy sexual attitude of entitlement. I know a lot of trans people. None of them would sleep with one of those people. Just saying, conservatives, you're safe. But the stronger opinion for them, the bigots who oppose drag, would be to plead that children do not need to be present at drag shows because it could be traumatic or harmful for their stage of development. In fact, that's an argument I can kind of get behind. In fact, one could argue that certain exposures to certain things before one's brain is developed enough to understand that, in context or out, is traumatic and results in side effects we can't even fathom. For how long, nobody can tell. I have been to some drag shows, more adult in nature, that I would say weren't suitable for an 8-year-old kid. Just like movies, video games, Sunday school, music. Wait a minute. That's the answer. The answer would just be to have rated drag shows, like a video game or movie. Rated E for everyone, PG-13, NC-17, restricted, 18 plus. There's a compromise, right? And we'd have to agree on the set standards for the judging of what is what, and that can, of course, get tricky, but we're off to a great start. That's not what they want, though. They want eradication, and we have to recognize that, and recognize that this is no different than any other issue or group before it or after. Social media allows that attitude to fester and then draw in more recruits by misrepresenting the issues, and then the telephone game we discussed. Too much too soon. There are a lot of plays I wouldn't want a kid to go to at a young age. I'm a stage performer, but even I can admit that some things out of context are unnecessarily confusing for a young child whose brain is developing. Could drag be one of those things? Probably not. The music choice may be more so than the visual of the drag performer, the dancing and choreography more than the individual themselves, maybe then the outfit. But of all the drag shows I've been to, there have been many, most of the skin shown isn't even skin, it's fabric or nylon or something. Could that be traumatic? Yeah. Yes, it could. It's overstimulation. The same as a concert, party, carnival, or county fair. Probably less traumatic than a gun and knife show or a truck and tractor pull, but depending on certain individual factors, they could be traumatic, I guess. Depending on how the parent prepared the child and then followed up after. You know, talking to your kid, raising your kid. I don't know the answer to whether drag would or could be on some level traumatic to a child of, say, 8 years old. But I certainly don't believe a child of 8 should do a lot of things parents allow 8-year-olds to do for whatever moral compromise. Teenagers are different. While they still struggle processing sarcasm, for example, they are better equipped to handle entertainment differently than their younger siblings. Still, this isn't the argument that's being made about drag, because if we have this conversation again, then we're probably going to have to talk about the brain development science that would suggest things like children under 21 going to religious ceremonies or any kind of religious education being traumatic. Children under not too much younger than that age being prevented from having access to the internet. Maybe they have access to an internet. Hell, maybe professional wrestling, hunting, reality TV, sports, the news. I don't know what the solution is that doesn't tread on freedom and censorship, but there has to be some middle ground of understanding that it isn't censorship to restrict children with developing brains from seeing the worst humanity has to offer too soon. I was talking about Sunday school, not drag. If we're all aware of the problem and acknowledge that problem, we can all put our heads together and try to fix it. Together. There's a thing called planned obsolescence. If you aren't familiar with this, planned obsolescence is where tech companies build in a self-destruct to your device so that when it reaches a certain age or software update, usually around the time a new device is released, your device starts slowing down, losing the ability to stay charged. It just becomes so unusable, inconvenient, that you just have to throw it away and get a new phone. You don't have a choice. America is, after all, a disposable society. Here today, gone tomorrow. We get a dog. We love that dog. The dog dies. We go right back out and get another dog to replace that dog. Hell, I know people who make the new dog wear the old dog's collar. We do that with living creatures. We surely do that with microwaves, TVs, cars, phones. It's all designed that way. We live in an age of unbelievable breakthroughs. Nothing needs to break or be thrown away. Well, it costs more to fix it than to buy a new one. I'm just going to let that land and sit here until it hits you. It costs more for one part of the thing than the whole thing costs together. Even close? Why would the part that you need to be cheap? It all has to be very expensive to add up to enough, so you just buy a new one. I mean, the washer and dryer is kind of old, and repairment will cost how much per hour? That's not even for the parts. Social media is the same for us. Just like MySpace begat Facebook, Facebook begat Insta, Insta begat Snapchat, Snapchat begat Vine, Vine begat Musical.ly, Musical.ly begat TikTok. Somewhere in there, you got YouTube in the mix, but YouTube is more of a TV network than social media, isn't it? Think of all the social media you've used and all those apps and trends you've jumped on. It's all so replaceable, isn't it? All the contributions you've made to those apps, where are they now? We are the constant on social media. We the people? No. We the profit. We are the social media currency. Our presence on social media is the only reason social media exists. It caught on and went viral, and we jumped on that bandwagon. But the minute it's gone, we're on to the next thing. In fact, often we determine the minute it's gone. Cancel culture, capitalism style. When we examine the principle of planned obsolescence in tech and manufactured goods, it becomes easier to see that reflective in our own lives. Just like the dogs and microwaves, we're quick to replace the thing without taking the time to appreciate having had the thing at all to begin with. Then we sort of lose that sense of gratitude, which is replaced with a sense of entitlement. Meagerness and simplicity are replaced with commercialism and materialism. All of that leads to competition culture, where everyone is racing to have the most and be the first to get it. Where does that leave us as a society? Especially on social media, where, again, our virtual spaces mimic our reality spaces. We're quick to unfollow, unfriend, or all-out block people we may have known for years. And maybe we thought it through. Maybe we considered the cultism they fell prey to, or we might have fallen prey to. Maybe we consider the consequences of that cultism. Many don't. Many are quick to act, slow to realize, and hardly to admit they were wrong. What we face in America, a big chunk of that toxic white Southern culture, is about pride. Foolish, foolish pride. To admit mom and daddy were wrong is to admit the preacher was wrong and the teachers were wrong, and it just keeps going. Most can't unwind that. They can't process that level of deconstructing, so we just put our heads down and carry on. And what results from that is a stagnant society fixated on the next big thing rather than reflecting on what just happened. Then, since at least 1981, we've just been flicking through the channels nonstop until we find something we like for 26 seconds before scrolling on. Our social spaces reflect our real spaces, and now our real spaces are starting to reflect our social spaces. Those lines of reality are continuing to blur for many as the cultisms we took into the virtual spaces have been chewed up, partially digested, regurgitated, and spit out by AI, right back into the real world. What we're left with is a circus sideshow house of mirrors distorted reality that isn't at all a reflection of what went into the AI of the internet. The telephone game tripping balls on DMT. And if we don't get it under control, who knows what this generation's kids will have to endure. Coming up, I'm cracking down on the social media platforms like YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and more. I'm deconstructing our addiction to connection and why we put up with so much from a technology that rarely leaves us warm and fuzzy, much less smarter. I think we're all on the same page that the internet is here to stay, but we need to do a hell of a lot better job today moving forward to change the culture in our virtual world and the real world. Speaking of, we can't talk about today's social media without talking reality TV more and how it bred the internet we all know and love today. That's sarcasm. I'm wrapping up the great social media experiment next, digging deep into the darkest, cobwebbed corners of the web for the real predators online. The apps we use to get online. Thanks for joining me. Check out some of my other videos on YouTube. I've got all my TikToks, my original music. I've got all the clips from my TV voiceover acting career, all of Overthinking Everything. It's all organized in playlists for your convenience. Check out my merch store on my website. Get your trigger tees in the Sir Talks a Lot, Swags a Lot store. More products are coming soon. Follow me on TikTok and everywhere online. Like, share, subscribe to this channel, and look, do all the things I need you to do to help me grow. And if you like this series, maybe consider a donation to Cash App. And don't forget to sign up for my email list. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.